My name is Colin Wallis. I'm the Executive Director of Kantara. Just a little bit, just to give you a sort of a kind of an overall sense of the organisation that Kantara is. We may have to go, we may decide to go into a little more detail on some aspects. So this is really, this first set of slides. It's just an overview of the organisation and some of the highlights, if you like, in terms of the specifications and so on. So from that perspective, probably this is fairly obvious, is that you have the transformation is achieved by collaboration, innovation, and taking action. It is in a sense, but as an industry consortia, you have this, this kind of strange connection, if you like, of competitors that are actually collaborating together, and you see that. You'll see that in perhaps organisations that are more well known in the APAC area, like TM Forum and ITUT and so on. You still have that sort of collaboration of competitors ethos, and it's certainly true in Kantara's case as well. And the reason is that you actually find, I would say perhaps less with ITUT, but certainly with TM Forum and certainly with Kantara and a number of other organisations you can see I'm going to put up on the screen later on, you have this sort of kind of sense of actually having to create something out of nothing. Because the standards bodies, your standard setting organisations like ISO and so on, simply take too long to get material up there. So the point is, if industry has a need for a particular specification or something, it has to really create it itself and move that forward and mature it to a point that it's capable of going to the ITUTs and the ISOs of this world. But that's where Kantara finds itself. It's right at the bleeding edge of some of this new work. So, and the point is that actually not that many people do it anymore. It's actually a lot more convenient and generally easier all round for non-profit industry consortia to just run conferences and do white papers, because it actually is quite hard to build specs to run operations. It's quite a big lift. So you'll find actually that many industry consortia don't do that. Which brings me to this slide really. There's a sort of, it's something I say on Twitter, if you follow me at all on Twitter, at Kantara Colin, is I often use this phrase, that others talk, we do. It's this combination of, yes, we've got a latest white paper, yes, come to our conference and so on, but there's no depth, particularly to many conversations. So I did want to, I think that Kantara stands by its operations and the work that it does in working groups. So as Alan said, it was non-profit founded around 2009 in the USA, Delaware-based, or Delaware Incorporated, Boston service management companies just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. The non-profit in Estonia was founded in January of this year, and that was done, it was an interesting exercise actually, because when I took the role, quit the New Zealand government in February of last year, was it? Year before? Last year. Yeah. So from at that particular point, the intention of the board was that Kantara Europe would be set up in the UK. And of course, I shifted to the UK to do exactly that. And then I arrived, and there was this thing called Brexit, a Brexit referendum. So the board met and said, well, it's never going to happen, etc. But let's just be sure that it doesn't. Let's just wait on and see what happens to the referendum. And sure enough, of course, we know what happened. That the referendum to leave the European Union and the EEA was undertaken. So the board said, okay, well perhaps we don't set up in the UK, we set up in mainland Europe. And so by this stage, of course, it was about August last year. And at this stage, there was, of course, we had the presidential election coming, and said, well, given the fact that we've actually had, a lot of the rhetoric, particularly out of Trump, the Republican side, doesn't seem to overly favour privacy and some of the things that, and surveillance and some of the things that Kantara would not be happy with. Perhaps we should just wait to see how the election goes. Of course, it will probably go the Democrat way, but let's just wait and see. And of course, we know what happened there. And so you can now understand why it was that in 2017 in January, we may have incorporated in Estonia with an organisation that's completely separate. So it's actually, it's in fact co-founded by Robin Wilton from the Internet Society and myself, and we run Kantara Europe as a licensee of Kantara US. And the specific reason for that is that that means that the data for Kantara Europe is stored on our servers in Frankfurt and is basically out of reach, if you like, of US administration. So that's specifically the reason why we've done it. The advantage of that potentially is that we could actually switch the US data into Europe should things go south in terms of surveillance. So that was one of the rationales for it. So Kantara's pretty strong on societal purpose and ethics, as you indicate from there, as you get a sense of from what I'm saying here. We have low barriers to participation is one of the things that the board is, makes my job a lot harder, but it's one of the things that the board is solid on, is that they want to encourage folks to be able to show up, to contribute and participate without actually paying any money out. Now, of course, there's a limit to how an organisation can actually continue to keep running like that. But the notion is that for a period of time and for a fair exchange of value, effectively you can contribute to working group and make contributions to working groups and to specifications and not pay any money to the organisation at all, provided you've actually agreed to IPR. Our other strong sort of piece of ethics is that return of control back to the user, and you'll actually see that coming through a lot of Kantara's specification work. It's got this notion of returning control back to the owner all the way through it. So you're starting to get a sense now, perhaps, when we talk about consumer identity build and consumer identity and access management, a theme that runs through there is this taking the users taking back control or controlling a lot of the direction and flow of their personal data. What are the things that we do then in terms of our business model? Well, I've given an indication there that we do have a partial membership model, but we also run a trust framework, and we have our own trust framework, which is based on NIST 863 version 2. It's a US specification, and we run that trust framework. Our primary customer there is the US federal agency, so GSA. But increasingly we're finding interest from other folks that want to use the Kantara governance model and trust framework model to use to bring in their own schemes to operate, for us to operate on their behalf. So we're seeing this expansion in the trust framework area, and have to Open Identity Exchange who have pioneered or championed the notion of trust frameworks, particularly in the very recent past. So I appreciate seeing Don in the audience. I'll hat tip there. So certainly, in terms of operation, we find that this is an increasing area of interest as folks want to be able to have confidence that credential service providers and identity providers are operating to a set of rules, and there's a third-party assessment to demonstrate and prove that, and it's proven with a trust mark. The other area, of course, is the specifications, and I've indicated, so did Alan, indicated that we develop those specifications. Typically, they're literally out of nothing. We develop those specifications where there really is nothing in the marketplace. We're running from a blank sheet of paper, and you'll see that as a classic case with consent receipt and user-managed access. Those specifications were built simply because there was nothing else like it in the marketplace. And we publish those. We have a publishing platform as well in the working groups that build those things. So the mission statement's written there, the global consortium on improving the trustworthy use of identity and personal data through innovation, standardisation and good practice. So you'll actually see as I go through this deck, you'll see how that is actually manifested in the way that we build work, the way that it comes into the organisation, the way it's processed and goes out the other end. So you'll see that shortly. So we certainly do some work with ISO. We have a formal liaison with ISO Subcommittee 27, which is Security Techniques, Working Group 5, which is the Identity Management and Privacy space. So we have quite a symbiotic relationship there with work going on. We contribute some of our work as it's going along in specification in specification land into the standards land. I mean, a classic case of the symbiosis there is with Nat Sakamura, who's the editor, who's already been mentioned this morning by Alan. And Nat is the editor of 29184, ISO 29184, which is the first committee draft. That's the online notices for privacy and consent. And of course, some of the consent receipt specification has been contributed back into ISO. So there's a brief rundown of some of our leadership and just a handful of our liaisons. It's a bit more on the slide there, but that gives you a sense of it. We are quite close to EMA in Europe. Typically, we find the organisations that we work with complementary. So, EMA doesn't really do a lot with working groups. It doesn't produce specifications, but it does do conferences and it does do white papers. So it works in a quite symbiotic and complementary way. Open consent, you'll see a little bit further down in this presentation how open consent is that it's a small organisation based in the UK and how they've worked with Kantara to build something different and new coming up. Cicada is actually I won't go through that very long acronym, but it comes from the US government, from DHS, and it's a R&D, refined and directed research and development program. Personal Data Ecosystem Consortium, PDEC, was probably one of the first in the personal data space, and quite recently, a year ago or so, created a formal liaison with Kantara. So a brief snapshot of the members, not all of them there, but that's a brief snapshot, if you like. So they're all around the world, and roughly speaking, if you look at the board of Kantara, it's actually less than 50% US, more than 50% around the world, and that's pretty much seen through the membership as well. Greater than half is outside of the US, even though it's a US incorporated organisation. So here are some things that Kantara has been most well known for. These three items really. Let's start with UMA. Now, user managed access that Alan talked about has been I'm trying to think, you said 2000 and, I thought 2012 that UMA formally started, but it may have been actually earlier than that. I do know when the first conversations were held, because if Eve Mailer, the editor and author of UMA initially, was here, she would say it first manifested itself actually in Wellington, New Zealand, and I was actually at that meeting, and it was the very first indication of this type of specification where we needed to find a way in which users would be able to control access with a lot of emphasis. In 2009 was a long time ago. Almost nobody was talking about access. It was all about authentication, and all we had in the marketplace was Exactly as a standard. And Exactly is XML based, and it's very enterprising. So it's a very centralized enterprising type. So it's basically enterprise giving access to somebody. That's very different to UMA, which is flipping that completely around, and it's providing the user who basically directs who can get access to their resources. So it's a complete 180-degree turn. It's based on the OAuth protocol, and OAuth, of course, is a kind of a two-party sharing. It's sort of it's basically it enables you to get access to your resources. It's not nearly as capable, if you like, out of the box to be able to do that third-party sharing. The kind of I want my GP to have access to my specialists, my health records located at my specialist's resource server. That's kind of three or more party sharing is something that that OAuth does not do out of the box. And effectively what UMA has done is extended the OAuth profile to enable it to be used in this much more extensible mode for the sorts of use cases that we are coming up with and finding much more these days in terms of having devices and having third parties with attributes and personal data. So of course it's designed to work into or be integrated with an existing application. It might be a personal data wallet. It might be sitting alongside an OpenID Connect or authentication. It might be within a particular service. So we've found that it's deployed in a number of ways that quite a vast variety of ways actually when I think across the spectrum. Even though it's still early days for UMA, we have a significant number of early adopters. The consent receipt specification is something that was started around 2013 from the Consent and Information Sharing Workgroup in Kantara. The Consent and Information Sharing Workgroup originally began a thing called the Standard Label, and you can actually see that work today, standardlabel.org. And effectively that standard label was a sort of statement around the terms in which information could be shared, basically. It gave your statement. It's the modern term for it is called user-submitted terms. But back in 2012-13, the standard label for information sharing was standard label was the term being used for that at that time. And consent came along a little bit later, and the notion was, I suppose the history was that the early drafts of the GDPR were starting to show what an important aspect that consent, how important consent was going to be to the general protection data regulation. So from that perspective, it came out and was developed to sit really on top of the standard label and extend it. So quite a lot of work's got involved in being a lot of people and work has gone into the consent receipt specification. It's really it can be delivered as a personal data receipt. It can be delivered in different ways, but the notion is that you're providing, you're agreeing a set of terms upon how your data is going to be processed, for what period, whether it can be revoked, what third parties are involved in the processing. So it has about 21 different sort of set fields that you can you can remove or add in the specification and add new ones. And some of the work on version 1.1 is adding things like purpose, which is pretty important as well. So from that perspective, the consent receipt has been well received as we work through, as we get closer and closer to GDPR. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Colin, a quick question. These slides, are they available for the
They will be?
participants at the end?
Yeah, don't have to take photographs of them. Yeah.
Okay.
It's, the slides are typically, in fact, this set of slides that was used at the Paris event should be on Kantara's website right now.
Okay.
You just have to go to the events part of on the website, and looking under events, you'll see archives there.
That would be KantaraInitiative.org.
Yes. I have one more question, Colin. So, you guys are doing a lot of good work, and I'm wondering, do you have, at Kantara, do you have employees who are paid by Kantara to do this work, or is it just the members, organizations, are they doing all the work and agreeing on these specifications?
It's a good question. Kantara has no employees. As the executive director, I'm not an employee, I'm a contractor. So the answer, broadly speaking, is no. It's mostly, it's nearly all done by volunteer contributions. However, when it comes to things like editing a specification, you know, there's one thing to contribute work, it's quite another to edit it and get it into a sufficiently mature draft. That's the area that you have to, that you often need some expertise. What we try and do is find sponsors for that work, because basically it takes too much out of the organisation to be able to find that directly out of member dues.
That was my cue. So yes, absolutely, it's all volunteer work. However, directed funds are gladly accepted. And so organizations, for example, someone like ForgeRock, that has a vested interest in seeing UMA succeed or seeing consent receipt or something like that, absolutely being able to come to Kantara, and in fact we've got a perfect example of that right now with what is it, the Consent Management Solutions Working Group, where we have two different organizations who have actually contributed some funds to enable at least some level of some support around building those standards. And so, you know, absolutely, directed funds are always very, very welcome.
Yeah. You know, so I'm thinking industry specific, so, you know, of course, financial services, banking, they also have a need to have some standards along these lines. So, you know, I was just thinking broadly, would it make sense for Kantara to approach, for example, a few big banks to say, guys, you guys are all struggling separately, why don't you contribute some funds and we will, you know, manage this in a nice, standard, common way.
I don't hire that man. Yes, absolutely. Yes, right. So those kind of events, I mean, the reality of it is that, in fact, that's what OIX is doing. Thank you, Don. But that's what OIX is doing in the UK. It's providing a space for that to happen, right? And so, obviously, we're not the only organization in the world that provides these kinds of things, and it's a, you know, we're all playing in the same game, but that's exactly the situation. Where there's a need, one of the things that all of these organizations do is that it gives us a hands-off, or at least an arm's length place the competitors can come and talk about a solution and come up with something for all of them to be able to work with, and a structure in order to do that.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be just the vendors, but also the customers who
Absolutely.
can drive the standards, right? Because they are.
We have that discussion probably every week.
I'm just like, from a neutral corner and member of both OIX and Kantara, so be transparent about that. The great work that OIX is doing at the moment around the financial API, I think is really important. They've really forged hard battles in banking and finance to get some starting point where banks are starting to agree. And I think if we could find a way to bring that work together where there is a starting place for the bank, together with understanding the importance of the consent work, into some kind of cross sandbox environment where we could either document white papers, use cases, or interoperability, that would be a big win. And in order to do that, we really do need the banks to participate because their brand lends weight, but also it starts to de-risk for them this whole open banking, this whole personal data shift. And so if you think that there is a way to influence that, I think there is great work that's already being done that would be crazy for us to start in this part of the world. It's crossed the Atlantic from the United States into Europe, and I think it dovetails with the great work that Kantara is doing. And I think it's also a great, safe, collaborative, collegial space for people to contribute. So that would be my call to action. Let's get some more weight behind it in this part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with all of those things. I mean, I think with with certainly the open banking project in the UK, Open ID Foundation has done a significant amount of work there on the authentication side. UMA, stands there ready and waiting to do the authorization, but consent receipt stands ready and waiting as well. We don't actually, Kantara directly at the moment doesn't contribute into that work. There are perhaps political reasons for that, but certainly individual organisations are, such as ForgeRock, and ForgeRock's basically championing UMA into that space. When that project gets to the point that it's needing to look at authorisation, just delegated authorisation. Interesting discussion. I totally agree with you, Katrina, that there needs to be some more, putting the pieces together in a more collaborative way. So I'd like to do that. I did want to just briefly talk about the accredited and approved. I talked about Kantara having the trust framework, the way that it builds, specifically offer its own trust framework, which is the NIST 863 version 2 specification. It has accredited assessors that assess credential service providers and identity providers against that NIST specification and grants them a trust mark. They're approved. So we have those two trust marks, Kantara accredited, Kantara approved, and as we extend the number of trust marks we're operating, we actually have to show them as different, as slightly different trust marks. These ones are going to be remodeled as classic, because of course many of you in the room know that we have 863-3 coming, the new NIST standard. It's already out. It was out last June, and there's 12 months to comply. So we have to differentiate. Kantara is working on building the requirements, drawing the requirements, the service assessment criteria from 863.3 in order to build a scheme around assessing credential service providers and identity providers against 863.3. So we have to show and differentiate the two trust marks, as well as trust marks that have arrived from schemes that are not Kantara's. So from that perspective, that's certainly what we're trying to do with the trust mark, the trust marks for the various schemes that we're operating. But you know, we did talk. We talked a little bit about UMA, and we talked a little bit about consent receipt. But there are other things going on as well. You know, with the hype around blockchain in a way. I mean, there's some interesting things, you know, happening there for sure. But the conversation is, I remember this when cloud, it was 2010 or 2011, you know, when the cloud hype began, and you could cook your breakfast on the cloud server in 2011. And now we're starting to see that happen again with blockchain, and it's, you know, completely out of control. Some of the conversation, you know, what its ability, you know. Its ability to do X, Y, and Z. You know, it's still fundamentally the distributed ledger, you know, the DIDs, the distributed identifiers. These are significant in the public key infrastructure that's required. You know, there's some fundamental sort of kind of building blocks in the way that you operate the blockchain part of this, and of course, you know, there's been a lot of debate. Hopefully the debate's going away about putting personal data off on blockchain, which, you know, seems to be ludicrous for many of us who have some thought to security, because if it's only protected by encryption, and we know ultimately that encryption can be broken. So that would be a really bad idea. But I did want to point out this was a quote from. Well, I can say it in the room, I couldn't put it on the slide, from someone in the US federal government. And basically, the blockchain smart contracts report from Kantara was extremely well received to counter the sort of kind of hype about particularly how the uses to which you can put blockchain and the role of smart contracts. Which is significant, but once again, it's not one of those things that, you know, you can't cook your breakfast with a smart contract either. You know, they're specific for specific use cases, and it's one of those things where a smart contract is only as good as the sort of context in which you put it. The eGov working group has been working on a code of conduct for aligned parties, because we spend so much time working with the identity provider and the credential service provider and the attribute provider. Very little is worked on is built around the aligned party. You see it more in federated trust frameworks. You see more rules around the requirements and conditions for relying parties, but you don't necessarily see it outside of federation. But, you know, we've got to remember that that trust frameworks can be federated or not. They don't. It's not an absolute necessity for a trust framework to have a federation. So we've got to be sort of kind of careful that we don't munge it up so that we make some assumptions that are not actually necessarily valid. The principles of relationship management was an interesting recommendation. We've got two of those. In fact, ForgeRock was originally involved in the early work. I think not so much in the refining the principles, but certainly the initial design principles. With Ian Glazer has taken that over with the refining the design principles that was taken in the last couple of years. That work has gone on, and I recommend you take a look at the refining of the 6 principles there. You'll see that they're basically the 6 principles basically design that they help with the consumer identity and access space in the way that you structure your application to make it to make it fit the 6 design principles, which just escaped me at the moment. Sorry, jet lag is going to provoke it all, something like that. I'll get on it. I wanted to briefly talk about the Federated Interoperability Working Group as well. There's not much SAML going on these days in terms of development, but there's still a whole lot of SAML out there. And one of the thoughts that the Federation Interoperability Working Group wanted to do was to really bring a lot of the SAML work together in one place to allow the vendors who are still supplying SAML products to have one place to go to fine-tune their features and functionality against. So what happened here was that some of the work originally out of the US government and then the higher education Federation interoperability space. This is InCommon, Internet 2, Terrainer, Refeds, some of those higher education folks who are running federations with SAML 2. We decided to actually put all that work together in one place, in one single profile, so that vendors can actually come to that place to see what a single set of requirements that they can then put into their products to enable third-party assessment and interoperability to take place after that. I've given a URL there, but it doesn't come up terribly well on the screen. But on Kantara's website, on the right-hand side, under the right-hand menu column under Resources, the first thing you'll see there is reports and recommendations. And they're basically listed there. These are all the public ones. So one of the advantages, of course, of contributing to the work and being a member is that you actually see the work that's actually in progress rather than the work that's published. So the real advantage there of getting ahead of the curve is to be involved in the work right from the get-go as it continues its trajectory through to an official publication. So I'm going to take you through a number of lenses here of Kantara's work. We use the sort of mantra, nurture, develop, operate as well, so that we basically take work in from a community. So folks arrive with typically a good idea, or particularly a community will arrive with a specific idea to profile a Kantara specification. We're starting to see that, for example, with the ad tech industry. Consent is such a critical part now of potentially how ad tech is going to have to go in terms of the GDPR. Because with GDPR, you can't just simply continue on with basically using a browser cookie and taking the information from that browser cookie, as the ad auction houses do today, and mine the hell out of that personal data and show you ads. And you're wondering, why am I actually getting this particular, why am I getting ads, this is retargeting, right? That, for a holiday I took, to a Pacific island last year. And the reason is that they're picking up the browser cookie and effectively looking back into their databases to see the information that's been attached to that cookie, and then they serve you advertising that's related to your browsing history. So here's a classic case where that's not going to work under GDPR. It's illegal. You have to be able to give consent for your information to be processed. This has caused the ad tech folks quite a lot of headache. First of all, their approach to it was to browbeat Brussels into saying that advertising was a legitimate purpose. Now, advertising can be a legitimate purpose if it's, SARS, or if it's a public epidemic. It absolutely isn't for holidays to a Pacific island. So the next thing was to then try and get consent, but actually have the consent taken on the publisher's website. So effectively, the publisher is liable for any misuse of the processing, when in fact, of course, the publisher has no control over the system, because it's actually the system is controlled by the brokerage houses of the ad tech vendors, typically Facebook, Google, those guys, but not only them. So here's a classic case of some new piece of technology or a new requirement coming in that has to be built, and it's from that the consent management solutions best current practice work group has been created. But we do have it from other places. We have folks that literally come in with an idea. Typically, you'll have they've got a particular idea. They've got some grant funding. It might be from an agency like the UN. It might be from from a foundation, and they need a platform to build it with. So Kantara can take those jobs in, if you like, and if they bring their community with them, use Kantara's platform to develop the specification, whatever it might be. So we go through this mantra of bringing something in, developing it, standardising it, drawing requirements out of it, to ultimately, the third session is to ultimately turn it into a conformity assessment program and a trust mark. So it's the idea of bringing it through, develop it, bring requirements out of it, and trust mark it. So another way of looking at this is, this sort of orchestrated harmony of bringing mutual competitive folks, into a collaborative space, combining it with membership and liaisons and partnerships, and then building some, having a governance structure in which to operate a program. So I've given a notion there that it's not unlike OIX, but Don's in the room, but broader than OIX's white papers and registry. Certainly if you put OIX and OpenID Foundation together, then that doesn't necessarily hold. So if you were on looking at our two-sided platform, where you've got the collaboration on one side and the programs on the other, it certainly looks a little bit like the OpenID Foundation from that perspective, but it's not limited to the OpenID protocol, because Kantara will take any piece of work basically that that is marketable effectively, and that has a use and some support and funding, and fits with the ethics and criteria of Kantara. Another way of looking at it is the sort of kind of invent, refine, implement, rather than nurture, develop, operate. And from that perspective, looking at it, you bring something completely new in, you refine it, and implement it out the other end. That kind of cadence is very similar to the FIDO Alliance, Fast Identity Online. In fact, interestingly, you have Brett McDowell, the Executive Director of FIDO Alliance, was Kantara's first Executive Director. So there have been three actually. So there have been, Brett McDowell was the first Executive Director, and then after Brett was Joni Brennan. Joni went on to become the President of DIAC, the Digital Identity Authentication Council Canada, and hand over the reins to me. So from that perspective, this sort of kind of maturation is very kind of similar to the FIDO Alliance. How many in the room for the FIDO Alliance have how many folks have heard of the FIDO Alliance here? So, right, okay, so it's about half of you. Yeah, that's not surprising actually, with some of the work that they're doing. So here I've just tried to give a sense of how the different consortia work together where they overlap, where they complement. I don't really, in terms of TM Forum and ITUT, because I'm thinking that those are more relevant in this part of the world. Certainly FIDO Alliance is a pretty full and complete sort of kind of cross-section. Kantara has a pretty full and complete cross-section. The Mobile Ecosystem Forum, less. It's specific on, it does have working groups and does do white papers, does do conferences. OIDF, Open ID Foundation, OAX together create a full spectrum as well. For ITUT, of course, it's a treaty organisation, very much like ISO, and it does have pretty much a full suite, I think, of across these different criteria. TM Forum certainly has working groups and does specifications. I don't know about some of the other things. So another way of looking at this is looking at sort of incubation, building these community groups, bring it into conformity assessment, and if it's a protocol, then interop testing. Of course, interop testing is not necessarily a Kantara thing. Certainly with Open ID Foundation having got for an interop test harness for the Open ID protocol, there seems little point in duplicating that effort. In the SAML space, there are a number of but smaller instances of interop testing. So they've been specifically done for government or for higher education, but there's not a broad suite static test harness necessarily available. So just finishing here, as we move towards having another break, is really I want to sort of finish off with these thoughts of the strong ethics around what we do, of giving user control, back to its owner, and we try to help our organisational members with that because they recognise it. It's a question of how to build it and how to build it in an interoperable way, so that you don't have this very where you don't have an uncomfortable user experience where you move from one application to another and the user experience is completely different. So the idea of trying to build personal control back into products is something that competitors need to work collaboratively on to make a smooth user experience for everybody. And also for the portability of data, because the reality is that folks want to be able to switch from one service provider to another, and they don't want to have to necessarily reconstruct all that data again. It should be possible with their directed consent to move that data across to another service provider. So we work on trying to build that kind of data portability structure into the things that we do. Briefly talking about brand association there, and certainly something that we offer our corporate members, the opportunity to sponsor work and to help develop and publish artefacts, as well as building the trust marks. We talked briefly about the centre of excellence and the network effect. I think you're getting a sense of the way that builds and develops there. I want to briefly talk to you a little bit about an event that we're working on. It's not official yet, but we're working towards a little event that we're going to do in London on January 29th, which is Privacy Day, Global Privacy Day, and we want to be able to put together an international privacy summit, which is specifically around some of these issues in the GDPR, and we're looking these 4 organisations are teaming to put on this event on Privacy Day to build some structure around the specifications needed for GDPR compliance. So keep a look out for that. You'll see some information appearing on Kantara's website and in blogs and Twitter sphere as time goes on. But it looks to be shaping up pretty well because while GDPR may not be a huge issue, you may not think in the Asia Pacific area, I certainly recall that in the US there has been that, oh well, it's in Europe, we don't have to worry. But the reality, of course, is very different. That if you're selling services online into, or online or otherwise, into Europe, then effectively, if you have European citizens as customers, then the GDPR applies. And one of the things that a lot of American organisations are starting to find is sometimes quite late in the piece, is that they're having to start to look at the GDPR quite carefully, and you've got to work out whether it's actually worthwhile running a two-tiered governance system with your data. In fact, it might be better to actually create one that's at a GDPR compliant level from the get-go, because it's almost harder to, if it's a heavy lift, to bring half the organisation or a third of the organisation's operations up to GDPR compliance level in the way that the data flows, and it's consented in the way that data is flowed and processed, then it's almost easier to actually take the whole organisation up to that higher level. Kantara Europe, that Alan Breaker mentioned, I won't go into too much detail there, except to say that we have the opportunity, of course, to create a Kantara APAC as well, in a very similar way that we've created a Kantara Europe. So it's one of the things that we want to really talk a little bit about this afternoon, and see if we can find a way to see if there's interest in creating a Kantara APAC in this area. Certainly, the Europe one is it's still under construction. A lot has happened this year, but we're getting it together piece by piece. So with that, I want to leave it there and take any quick questions before we break for coffee.
Could you just clarify, Colin, about the difference between the trust marks? So you've got approved and accredited. Can you just clarify again what the difference is?
Right, good question. So approved and accredited, the accredited trust mark is actually for assessors. So that's, we're accrediting third-party assessors, auditors, if you like, to actually do the assessing. So we have a process for accrediting assessors and auditors, and we have a process for the accredited assessors to approve credential service providers and identity providers. That's why we have the two fundamental structures of accredited and approved, and on top of that you have the trust mark to which they belong. So up until very recently, in fact literally now, we still have the original trust mark that we had, which was based on 863.2. And what I tried to point out was you can see a branding difference as we go forwards with the existing one, that one there, yep, there. Those are going to have a word classic attached to them, and you'll have another one called next generation, or 863.3, we haven't decided what we're going to call that. You'll actually see in the fullness of time another trust mark with a particular community's brand on it. So it's not going to be, it's still going to have Kantara there, and the Kantara approved, but this other brand altogether. So it's quite an interesting thing when you're running multiple different trust marks. it's quite a challenge from a marketing, branding, visual logo association perspective. Good question, though. Thanks. With that, we're done.